It's about that time of year again. Thanksgiving is on the horizon, and if you're in the US, soon you'll be stuffing your gullet even more than usual, role-playing just like a good ogre should. The kingdoms of the Great Maw have been front and center for the last several weeks. Soon we'll be on to new friends and ancient enemies, but before we get there, we have a couple more important things to cover. The unit roster is, of course, a big one, and that is what we're going to tackle today, as an entire race of monsters and monstrous infantry slams home with all the impact of a warpstone meteor. Now, we already have a pretty good idea of what to expect here, given all the gameplay that's been revealed over the last week or so I'll keep this shorter than my previous roster videos. There's a lot more detail on how exactly these lords and units will play, and it's always helpful to see the entire list in one place, because it gives us a point of comparison in relation to the other factions of Warhammer 3. The Ogre Kingdoms roster will be the most complete of any day one race, unless the Demons of Chaos Undivided happen to get recombined under Be'lakor the Dark Master as a separate sub-faction. If that happens, we probably won't know about it until much closer to launch. So, good news if you're an Ogre fan. They have a lot of content on offer, and a banging selection of creatures to lead on your conquest of the Mountains of Morn and beyond. Greasus Goldtooth and Skrag the Slaughterer are your starting legendary lords, and on the one hand, we have the Over Tyrant, gearing up to snap everyone in existence straight into his portly potbelly with the Infinity Gauntlet, Thanos style. Don't know whose idea that was, but that's pretty brilliant. And instead of riding on his magic carpet of Noblars, he has a new pimp mobile that makes Flava Flav look like a down-to-earth gentleman. On the other hand, we have Skrag the Slaughterer, the caster lord of the Ogres. Now is probably a good time to quickly cover gut magic and the lore of the Great Maw. Remember that all gut magic involves literally eating ritual totems of flesh and bone, becoming psychically attuned with the Great Maw, and manifesting these spells in a physical and tangible way on the mortal plane. It's a bit different than the typical winds of magic we see from the ether, so just keep that in mind. Brain Gobbler is the first example, a -16 leadership debuff that vomits nightmares into an enemy's mind, making them especially susceptible to terror routes. Bull Gorger is a single target buff to melee and AP weapon damage, nothing super special there. Toothcracker is an AoE armor and missile resistance buff, which will be especially important because ogres tend to have low base armor, and they're huge targets, which means they'll be very susceptible to missile fire. So if you're aiming for a Death Star blob of monstrous infantry when you play the Ogre Kingdoms, Toothcracker will be one of the few ways you have to mitigate focus fire from missiles and enemy towers, at least until you start rolling with squadrons of Ironguts. Bone Crusher is an armor-piercing explosion, meant for dealing with Chaos and Black Orc infantry, both of which may give you a decent amount of hits in mid to late game. And the Maw is a giant chasm that yawns wide and deals more AP damage when overcast, while Troll Guts is a single target heal, similar to Regrowth. And looking at the spell selection on offer here, I'd say Troll Guts will likely be your most important tool out of all 6 of these spells, just because it'll keep your lords and expensive monsters alive. If your Stonehorn is dropping low, pop a Troll Guts on that, and it'll go pretty much right back up to full. If Skrag the Slaughterer, if Greasus Goldtooth, if any of your important single entities are caught out, this is the spell that will keep them in the fight. It's almost a 40% heal. Very important on that front. Now, on the offensive side of the lore, there's a lot more up in the air. I need to see more of it. I was not impressed with the Maw in the Minor Settlement Siege. I saw it in action there, and it really didn't deal very much damage to Khornate infantry at all. But Khorne does have magic resist, which skewed the test, so not a full picture developed so far. Sounds like Skrag will also have a Gorger summon in campaign, similar to Throt the Unclean's Beast Pack ability, and obviously being able to summon an entire unit of Gorger bodyguards is quite impactful. So if you get surrounded, or if you get caught out, bring those into the fight, and that should turn things in your favor pretty quick. So before we dive further into the roster, let's take a look at everything in its totality, and give you guys a look at what to expect on launch day. So, for generic lords, we have the Tyrant and we have the Slaughtermaster, which comes in 2 flavies, the Great Maw or Lore of Beasts. And 9 times out of 10, I'd say you're probably going to gravitate towards the Great Maw, simply because Beast is middling to crappy in both campaign and multiplayer. It's not terrible in multiplayer. Transformation of Kadan is nice, but when you've got regrowth essentially in the Lore of the Great Maw, I think you'll typically want to go for that instead. And Beast is better on highly mobile casters that can spam Flock of Doom at a really low cooldown, that kind of thing. You simply won't be able to do that because you won't have mobility on your Slaughter Master. Great Maw is going to be a better choice in both game modes, I believe. From the hero's perspective, we've got a Hunter who can mount a Stonehorn. We've got the Butcher, Lore of Great Maw, or Lore of Beasts. Fire Belly with only Lore of Fire, of course. They vomit fire, it's kind of what they do. For Infantry and Missile Infantry, Gnoblars and Gnoblar Trappers. For Monsters and Monstrous Infantry, you have standard Bulls with standard Maces, Bulls with dual weapons, and Bulls with Iron Fists. We have Ironguts. They only come in one variant, the Great Weapon variant. We have 4 variations of Man-Eaters. Regular Monstrous Infantry, which we haven't seen yet. I believe those are the Arabian-looking ones in the unit card we showed off in a previous video. Man-Eaters Iron Fists, Man-Eaters Great Weapons, Man-Eaters Pistols, and then the Saber Tusk pack, that'll be your highly mobile backline Hunter. Gorgers, the umpteenth Giant variant, Stonehorn, for Missile Monsters and Beasts, Stonehorn with Harpoon Launcher and Lead Belchers. And for Cavalry and Chariots, Mournfang Cavalry, the variant we already have in-game right now in Warhammer 2, Mournfang Cavalry with Iron Fists, Mournfang Cavalry with Great Weapons, and 2 variants of Rhinox Cavalry, Crushers with Iron Fists, and Crushers with Great Weapons. For Artillery and War Machines, we have the Scrap Launcher and the Iron Blaster. And we're missing Thunder Tusk, Yetis, and the Bruiser. I believe those are the only 3 units that this army book is missing. But they're ones that I'd like to see a lot, especially the Thunder Tusk. Another single entity monster would have been really nice for this roster, instead of just having the Stonehorn and Giant. But it looks like they will be DLC. Diving a bit deeper now into the Lord options, Ogre Tyrants are your melee Lord choice, the biggest and strongest and fiercest in the tribe, collecting big names and dominating the opposition with their big old floppy titties. Expect them to perform a similar role to Doom Bulls or other monstrous infantry. They're going to hit like a goddamn Mack truck, but they're going to do exactly what you expect them to do. They're going to fight stuff, they're going to beat it up, they aren't going to bring a whole lot more to the table than that. On the caster side though, Slaughter Masters are reasonably okay in melee, but minimal mobility means positioning with them will be quite important, and they'll support the melee fight with heals and big damage spells. Ogre Hunters are a very interesting option from the hero section. They have a great throwing spear that grants a somewhat rare ability amongst Ogre units, and that they have consistent damage from range. Perhaps more importantly, they are the only character type in the entire roster with a mount option. Stonehorns will break the game wide open for them and make them a go-to pick in a lot of scenarios. If doom stacking has not changed at all, you are going to see entire hordes of just Stonehorns and Hunters on Stonehorns. Very strong combination. It's a huge tanky infantry mulching mount that can't be reliably felled by missile fire, combined with ranged DPS from an armor-piercing throwing spear. That's fantastic. It doesn't get a whole lot better than that. Ogre Hunters are gonna be really good. Not much to talk about on the Butcher side. They're essentially the same thing as Slaughter Masters, just in a hero-sized package. But Fire Bellies are super cool. They'll be your only casters with access to the Lore of Fire, which is very good combat magic in both campaign and multiplayer. And because they've gobbled down lava from the greatest volcano in the Mountains of Morn, and somehow lived to tell the tale, they have 3 bound abilities that offer even more utility. Fire Breath is just what it sounds like, a breath attack dealing armor-piercing and explosive damage, similar to what you might see from a dragon, if dragons were land-bound and super fat, while Flame Incarnate is a ward save aura that surrounds your caster and quite literally reflects damage back at attackers. Cannot wait to see that in action. And Eruption is an explosion to help with wave clear and give your Fire Belly a bit more room to escape when things are starting to get hairy. I almost think it was a missed opportunity from Games Workshop to not further explore the Firemouth elements of Ogre Society, because I feel like an entire sub-faction could have been developed here around just them alone. They have a really unique and interesting aesthetic that they have going for them, and I think there's a lot of cool stuff that could have been done to further flesh them out. Moving on to the infantry selection, Gnoblars are even shittier cousins of goblins, used as slaves and meat shields. Super slow, terrible leadership, but important simply because we know how ineffective monstrous infantry can be when they don't have foot troops out in front. You need some kind of chaff, or monstrous infantry just does not perform well. That's true in pretty much all battle types in Warhammer 2. I imagine that isn't going to change much in Warhammer 3. The Gnoblar Trappers are much more interesting than the regular Gnoblars, though. They have short-range nets that deal damage and slow opponents. somewhat similar to precursor javelin volleys from Rome 2. Certainly not as deadly, but will still be useful from that side of the utility aspect alone. And they have Vanguard, which allows them to scout in advance and set up ahead of the main assault. Ogre Bulls are the run-of-the-mill monstrous infantry, your early game stuff, coming with standard maces, a bonus versus infantry dual weapon variant, and an Iron Fist variant, which are essentially melee gauntlets that double as shields and protect the bull from missile fire and increase his melee defense. All Ogre infantry have the Ogre Charge special rule, which we have seen in Warhammer 2 with the mercenaries, and it basically means that their charge is still somewhat effective even through braced charge defense against large units like halberds and spears. I still think that having full armies of monstrous infantry will be somewhat weak in campaign and certainly in multiplayer battles. I think that going up against pure bonus versus large stuff will be problematic. You will need Noblars, as we said. You will need the single entity monsters. Just going pure infantry, not going to work out too well for them. But the fact that they can charge through halberds and charge defense against large units will certainly help them out a little bit, at least, in those kind of melee engagements. But in terms of the higher tier stuff, Ironguts have me quite excited because they can take quite a bit more punishment than your standard Ogre Bull. As their name might imply, they're given the best armor and best weapons in the tribe, wielding enormous scimitars and clubs, dishing out damage and taking incoming fire simply way better than the other monstrous infantry we've already discussed. And they look freaking sick, so they've got some style going for them too. They're going to make up the bulk of your forces come mid to late game, especially if single entity doom stacking is curbed somewhat, which I imagine it probably will be. I mean, to an extent, we already know it is, simply because wounds are being introduced for the first time. Whether CA feels that will be enough in and of itself, I do not know, but we'll probably find out soon enough. Man-Eaters, on the other hand, are similarly skilled to the Ironguts of the tribe, but they're less focused on survivability and more ostentatious in their battle garb, preferring to take on the traits of the regions they find employment in. If the unit cards are any indication, they may end up looking slightly different amongst their 4 variations, depending on the weapon types they wield. And as we've said before, in a perfect world, wherever these mercenaries hail from, each of these variations would have a slightly different aesthetic going on. So Arabian dervishers would wear Arabian-style clothes and wield Arabian-style cutlasses. I think that would be an awesome little nod to the lore there. You could have Norscan ones that are a bit more chaotic in their garb and the way they decide to take on combat. And then, of course, the Imperial ones wielding pistols and maybe wearing feathers in their caps, wearing more Imperial State Trooper type of garb would be a nice little touch for them as well. But regardless of whether or not that ends up happening, it does kind of seem like the unit cards are pointing towards that direction, but we didn't get a good enough look to fully know. Great weapons and pistols are the current tier 5 choices, and the Iron Fists and regular monstrous infantry versions will be easier to access at tier 4 and tier 3 respectively. I still have some concerns about pistols at tier 5. I don't think their current Warhammer 2 version would be deserving of such high prerequisites to maintain or acquire, given their combat performance in Game 2. I don't think they're terrible, but I don't think they're tier 5 either. Perhaps they'll be getting some buffs moving into Game 3, though, to bring them up to snuff, because at the moment I just think they're a little bit too expensive, a little bit too late in the game for me to really be worried about recruiting them at all. All of these variations, though, are immune to psychology, which is helpful when faced with a bunch of terror-causing demons that we'll be getting in Warhammer 3, so good from that standpoint at least. Saber-Tusk Pack are cool. They're like War Lions for the High Elves, using their 95 speed to hunt down artillery, and even heavily armored monsters when used in conjunction with higher leadership units. They're not going to be able to take down a demon, a greater demon, a bloodthirster, or a keeper of secrets, or anything like that, all by themselves, but you give them some support, and they can hit pretty damn hard. They are several orders of magnitude more powerful than your standard Warhounds or Direwolves. Lots of mass and killing power here, good weapon damage, but they can also rampage, so not quite as reliable as some of your other monstrous cav. The Gorgers are a very interesting unit as well. 54 speed, Vanguard, Stalk, and Unbreakable, as well as regeneration when buffed by Skrag the Slaughterer and his Cauldron. They are not resilient at all, they only have 15 armor, but they do perform a similar role to Mournguls as a bonus versus infantry, armor-piercing ambusher with solid mobility. Probably going to be one of the first multiplayer strats I try out in Warhammer 3, actually. Trying out a full Vanguard rush with Gorgers. If you watch my ever-chosen matches with Pippington from the Vampire Coast tournament all the way back in 2018, probably a similar style to that. Should be a lot of fun to try to ambush somebody with a full stack of them. Giants are giants. They're stupid and lame. Would like to see them drop down to tier 3 so that people actually consider buying them. And I would not mind another balance pass from Creative Assembly to try and make them a bit more viable, because they're ass in campaign, they're ass in multiplayer. The only time they're really ever viable now is with the Beastmen at tier 3, and it's only because they were moved down to tier 3 with their latest rework and Torox the Brass Bull. So some combination of additional missile resist and speed would probably help out Giants quite a bit, but honestly, focus fire from archers and handguns in this series is so overpowered anyway. I'm not sure what a big lumbering buffoon with a ginormous hitbox can possibly do to survive against competent opponents. They're just not very good. Stonehorns, though, are a unit to watch out for sure. They come in essentially 3 variants: a basic melee version, a harpoon launcher version, and a hunter version with the Great Spear up top. But they're essentially a mix of Mammoth and Cambrian War Sphinx in terms of their stat line, very much focused on the charge and their infantry blending potential, with higher than average missile resist because of their rocky exterior. Lead Belchers will be a lot of people's favorite, I think. Firing handheld cannons with obscene range and devastating power, they make it easy to take air forces out of the sky permanently. Probably quite a good counter to the Sky Lanterns and Sky Junks of Cathay, though I don't know yet if they'll be better for wave clear or for sniping out high HP single entities. I imagine they're not incredibly accurate, but they can probably still put a punishment on anything from downtown. And finally, we've waited so long for it, the new breed of monstrous cavalry making its debut. And it's not just Mornfang Cav, it's Rhinox in as well. And they have a plethora of options to choose from, which warms my heart to no end. Mornfangs come in 3 flavors: the regular kind, Iron Fist with missile block chance and better melee defense, and great weapons for armor piercing and presumably bonus for large as well. While the Crushers will be a more heavily armored, higher tier version with better charge bonus and killing power across the board. Also coming with Iron Fist and great weapon variants. But there's really not much to them. They run over things and obliterate them with their 80+ charge bonus. Cannot wait to use them for myself, but they aren't really a surgical scalpel. They're more just a brutal and bloody hammer that can bludgeon anything that gets in their way. And here at the end, with artillery and war machines, the Noblar Scrap Launcher and the Iron Blaster, both pulled by Rhinox, both doubling as melee chariots with huge weapon strength and charge, but garbage melee stats, blowing up hordes of infantry and cav alike from downtown. Scrap Launcher will outrange almost all siege weaponry in the game, and the Iron Blaster, from its description, well, it wields long-forgotten weapons of the Sky Titans, annihilating just about anything it targets with multiple cannonballs each time it fires. But it will run out of ammunition quite quickly, at which point you just charge it into melee and teach those noobs who's boss, right? So overall, it's a very nice selection of units to choose from. Tons of monstrous cavalry, powerful artillery options, strong lords, and what's shaping up to be a very useful lore of magic in the shadow of the Great Maw. I do think the lore of the Great Maw is going to be a powerful selection of spells. Troll Guts in particular, that regrowth for monstrous infantry and your single entity monsters will be game-changing in and of itself, although the DPS side of that lore is still kind of up in the air for me. Thundertusk would have just about made this roster perfect, but in some ways, it's good to have confirmation that the Ogre Kingdoms will have post-launch support with Lord Packs, and I would take this pretty much as a confirmation of that fact. You're not leaving out cool units like that unless you have something planned for them, and my personal vote would go to the Man-Eater himself as their first free LC, and Gark Ironskin and his demonic mechanical Rhinox as their DLC many months after launch, with Yetis, Bruisers, and Thundertusks joining him on Crusade somewhere down the line. It's a good roster though, and besides the campaign mechanics for Skrag and Greasus, which we'll cover soon, we are very close to turning this chapter of the Warhammer 3 pre-launch rush to something a bit more devilish. We'll have more information on that front as soon as I can share it, Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you all in the next video. Indy Pride, signing out for now. Have a good one, guys.